breaking the cycle of our forefathers' sins. I'm Jodell Onstott, and this is episode 118 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I know your time is very valuable, and I am so glad that you are spending it with me and that we can have these thought-provoking discussions together. Please do drop your comments, drop your feedback, whether you agree, you disagree, challenge. I do appreciate the dialogue, and I do come back and look at the comments a little bit later. So thank you so much for your engagement and for giving thought to some of these often challenging ideas. In this series, we started with the idea of epigenetics. We looked at the covenant and the idea that the sins of the fathers, the iniquities, are very often inherited by the children. They manifest most strongly in the third and fourth generation, but as we're going to see today, these sins continue often for 2,000, 3,000 years. And we are seeking Yahweh. We are returning to those ancient paths. We're looking to Abraham, our father. We're looking to Moses. We're looking to the original, thus says Yahweh in scripture, the original written word that we find to see what truth it holds for us today. And in this, we are seeking healing that we have not seen, reformation, and a change in what is becoming an increasingly wicked world. We are seeking to heal and to change that. But the question is how? Now, I have presented Leviticus 26 verses 39 through 40 and verse 42 as the healing code, as the process that can break the chains of our father's iniquity. But this is often very difficult. And today I see that we are at a crossroads. We have one path that will devolve back into chaos and war, persecution, the fall of the West, the fall of Western cultures, the fall of Judeo-Christian ideas to be replaced by largely on one side, Islamic ideas, on the other side, very atheist, communist, Marxist ideas. And we think we're immune. We think that, oh no, this could never happen. But if you're thinking along that lines, you just have to look at world history. No nation exists beyond about 250 years. And when it does, it's because it's following natural law, and natural law parallels divine law. It walks in the ways of Yahweh that were revealed at Mount Sinai. Today, 2026, we are at this crossroads. The average age of the people that have a heart, that feel like they are being called back to God, that are seeking the ancient paths, the average age is between 50 and 70 years old. Now, if you go into churches or synagogues and you see a congregation of largely older people, what happens? In 20 years, it dies out. It's no longer there. Yes, we have a few people in their 30s, a few people in their 20s, and we even have some younger people. But the problem for these younger people, most of them, is that they don't have mates. There's nobody for them to marry, to carry on the Abrahamic faith, to transmit these ideas to the next generation. So what I want to know, what I am seeking is how can we all of a sudden make this truth? I mean, this is truth. This is healing. This is something that can change our future and our world for the better, away from this wickedness that we're seeing in the Epstein files, this corruption of government that always seeks to control every thought, everything that we do. I mean, we are heading towards something that is very, very ugly and repeating the same mistakes that our ancestors have done on and ad nauseum. So when we look at the plan, the path of salvation that Yahweh has given to us, what we discover is a idea, a path for absolute healing and transformation. However, it doesn't mean that that process isn't going to be a little bit painful. It doesn't mean that it isn't going to come with some heart-wrenching moments, because if we just continue doing what we're doing, we're going to get the same results. And what Yahweh warned us in Leviticus 26:39 is that for 2,000 years, throughout the diaspora, we would pine away in our forefathers' sins. We would fester in those sins. And that we would not reject their ancient choices, but we would continue to accept them, continue to view those choices as valid, and believe in the choices of our forefathers rather than the word of Yahweh. Now, when most of us hear these ideas, we tend to deflect. We say, oh yeah, that's not me. Or that's not my walk with God. I believe, and we justify ourselves rather than comparing. I mean, the standard is always the Torah. The standard is always Yahweh's written word. And when we justify ourselves rather than holding ourselves accountable to Yahweh's written word, we just continue in our forefathers' iniquities. And today we're going to look at one iniquity that is very, very tough. It is one that a large amount of people that love God, a large amount of people that seek to walk in his ways are still doing. We still hold on to it because we trust man, we trust our forefathers' word and our forefathers' teachings, and we put it first and above Yahweh's written word. So often when we do hear also about this, there's another tendency. There is this contrast, this conflict, and it's a historical conflict between Ephraim and Judah. Because when we read these verses, Christians' natural reaction is to point the finger and say, oh yeah, it's Judah. They're the ones that have departed. They're the ones that are not accepting the truth. It's all the Jews. But then on the other side, we have Judah. And so many Jews, and I see this often in my conversations, they do the exact same time. They're pointing the finger at Christians and saying, yeah, look, it's Christians that have departed from the law. It's Christians that have, continue in idolatry and they don't walk in the ways of Yahweh. But if we're going to be honest, with the text, it isn't just Jews or Christians. It is both groups. Both groups have departed from Yahweh. Both groups have added to and diminished from Yahweh's word. And both groups have led people astray. And what we want to do is reverse this process. We're looking for healing. And Leviticus tells us, Yahweh tells us in his testimony in Leviticus 26, that steps that we have to take for healing. We have to first remember our ancestors' sins. We have to acknowledge those sins. And in that process, we have to allow our eyes to be open to the consequences of those sins. And by doing that, by remembering and acknowledging, we can then take that final step of confessing that yes, indeed, those actions and yes, indeed, those beliefs do violate Yahweh's written word. So today, we are going to look at one belief that most of us struggle with today. And it's a belief whereby our rejecting of it displays the fact that we really see Jeremiah as a false prophet. Now we're going to say, oh, no, that's not me. I totally accept Jeremiah as a true prophet who spoke in Yahweh's name, who had Yahweh's word and was a prophet of truth. But do our actions reveal that? Actions always speak louder than words. So what do our actions reveal? The book of Jeremiah specifically addresses not Ephraim so much, but Jerusalem's Jews. The iniquity and the loss of understanding was absolutely complete. And I think so many of us really miss this point. We want to say, oh, well, Ephraim had lost a knowledge and understanding of Yahweh, but the Jews had retained it. Jeremiah really challenges that idea. Turn to Jeremiah 5 verse 1, because Jeremiah alleges that one could search through the entire city of Jerusalem and not find a single person who had knowledge or understanding of Yahweh's law, no one who executed judgment or who sought truth. Let's turn with me to Jeremiah verses 1 and 2. Turn and run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem and see now and know. Seek in the broad places of it. Can you find a man? Is there anyone who executes judgment that seeks truth? And I will pardon it. In other words, Yahweh is saying he will pardon the city. And though they say Yahweh lives, surely they swear falsely. So Jeremiah is accusing this remnant. Remember, Ephraim was deported about 120 years before this. You may have had some stragglers from Ephraim that resorted to Jerusalem during Hezekiah's days, but mainly this is going to be Benjamin, Judah, Simeon, and the Levites who were cast out of the northern kingdom. And Jeremiah is accusing them of swearing in Yahweh's name, but being deceitful in the way that they use it, because they would say that they would do something. They would invoke Yahweh's name, but then they wouldn't follow through. They wouldn't uphold their word. And this became one of Judah's great sins. And it led to a very turbulent history where they continually and habitually swore in Yahweh's name, but failed to uphold their agreements. They wouldn't acknowledge that they had to follow through with whatever they said. And they would do this again at a very, very crucial point, to actually two specific crucial points in the nation's future. Now, let me give you a little bit of background to this, because unless we understand what the precedent was, what the truth was, and what God required, we can't really go forward and understand the context of Jeremiah's words and how many of us today continue to reject Jeremiah's words. So let's first return to the written word of Yahweh, because that is always our standard. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 13, Yahweh tells us how we are to fear him. He tells us the proper manifestation, the proper way by which we show a very healthy fear of him. And this is what it says in Deuteronomy 6, verse 13. You shall fear Yahweh your God, serve him, and shall swear by his name. So this swearing by Yahweh's name is so important because it places accountability on us. Remember, the covenant said that Yahweh would not hold us guilty or guiltless. He wouldn't hold us without guilt if we swore in his name and then failed to follow through with what we had agreed to do. This is important because when you invoke Yahweh's name, you're asking for his assistance. You're asking for him as a witness to witness your agreement. You're asking for his help to help you bring forward, to complete the agreement, to adhere to it. But when you use it carelessly, when you swear in that name deceitfully, having no intention, you invoke it on the pretext, but then you don't follow through, that has severe consequence, as we will see. Now, let's continue with a little bit of the background, because swearing in Yahweh's name was not this vague concept. It was actually had a very specific divine formula, which was as Yahweh lives. And then we have over 40 examples of Israelites swearing in Yahweh's name that exist in the Tanakh. The first instance occurs under Joshua, and it continues throughout the end of the monarchy. And here's just a few examples. When Ruth sought Boaz to perform the role of a redeemer kinsman for a Levirate marriage, Boaz pledged in Yahweh's name in Ruth 3:13, and he pledged to redeem Ruth, and this is what he swore in Yahweh's name, saying, I will do the part of a kinsman to you as Yahweh lives. And that is Ruth 3:13, if you want to put that in your notes. When Jonathan received his father's oath that he would not kill David, King Saul swore in Yahweh's name. This is what the text says. Saul hearkened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as Yahweh lives, David will not be killed. That's 1 Samuel 19, verse 6. Later, King Saul violated his oath to Jonathan and sought to kill David. During one campaign, King Saul's military position delivered him firmly into David's hands. However, David refused to kill Yahweh's anointed, saying, these are David's words, "As Yahweh lives, Yahweh will smite him, or his day will come to die, or he will descend into battle and perish." But David pledged in Yahweh's name that his hand would not be the one to kill Saul. The phrase, "as Yahweh lives," was the method whereby Israel they demonstrated a fear of Yahweh, and they swore in his name by invoking it. People were calling for Yahweh again to work on their behalves and to hold themselves accountable. This placed Yahweh's reputation on the line. Now, it may be remembered, too, that at the burning bush, Yahweh gives Moses a separate name that distinguishes him from the other gods. One name that is also recognized for God, is kind of a generic appellation, is the word Elohim. But Elohim itself was a carryover from the Canaanite ideology of God. In Canaan, the God was known as El. But over time, the people, the priests, corrupted that understanding. They added a lot of pagan ideas, a lot of pagan philosophies to that name, so that that name really couldn't be redeemed as an independent representation of who Israel's God was, of the ideas that he held, and the beliefs that he was bestowing to Israel. So Yahweh had to make a little bit of a break with the idea of Elohim to establish his own name, his own fame, his own reputation in his revelation at Mount Sinai and again in the plains of Moab before Israel crossed over Jordan, as well as an ongoing clarification. It's not really a new revelation, but a constant clarification every time Israel went out of the way of saying, come back and listen to the words of Yahweh and walk in them. You know, you see this throughout the Psalms. You see this throughout all the words of Israel's prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, as well as the prophets that are recorded in the books of Kings and Chronicles. So as the monarchy comes to a close, as the kingdom of Israel, and more specifically, the kingdom of Judah, as their sins and the iniquities. I mean, these are sins and iniquities that began with their forefathers, and Israel never turned from them. Their forefathers chose to ignore the written Torah. They chose to rebel against it. They chose to create their own man-made ways, their own man-made traditions and philosophies, and they never departed from it. So as we come to the final years of Judah's history, because when we come to Jeremiah, we're only looking at about 40, 50 years of his ministry that Judah has to turn back to Yahweh before that final curtain falls and their national independence is gone for 2,500 years. And because of this, Jeremiah understood the importance of fearing Yahweh, because it's only in fearing Yahweh that one begins to turn their heart and their actions back to him. Very early in Jeremiah's ministry, he pledged and he made it his mission to turn the Jerusalem's Jews who had forgotten Yahweh and forgotten his law back to remembering Yahweh, to remember Yahweh's statutes, his judgments, his covenants, and his testimonies and his laws. Because idolatry was all the rage in Jerusalem. It began much earlier. It began in the days of Uzziah, when he sought to burn a very profane incense. It continued through the days of Hezekiah. Yes, there were periods of reformation under Hezekiah, under Josiah, but you know what? They didn't last because the heart of the people was continually wayward. Baal and Ashtoreth were a divine couple. They were this duality of manifestation of a Godhead that provided immediate hope of salvation. Israel could rid themselves of this God who said, well, if you violate my covenant, these are the consequences, and this is going to happen to you, and this is going to happen to you. Instead, all they had to do was worship Baal and Asherah, and it didn't involve any change of lifestyle or change of heart. But Jeremiah knew that Israel needed to fear Yahweh, not Baal. He saw that the lives of Judah's citizens were teetering in the balance and found wanting. He encouraged the Jews to return to Yahweh's written law, which instructed Israel to fear Yahweh by swearing in his name. Jeremiah took hold of this specific law out of all the covenant, this specific law as both a means to first turn Jerusalem's Jews back to fearing Yahweh, and second, as a test by which to gauge their faithfulness and their willingness to obey Yahweh's instructions. Now, let me reiterate this point again, because Deuteronomy 6:13 Jeremiah uses it as a test in Jerusalem's final days. It was a test to see whether the people were willing to obey. And if they were willing to obey, to swear in Yahweh's name, they would actually turn back time. They could turn back their ancestors' sins, and they could enjoy peace. This is what Jeremiah promises in chapter 4, verse 1. And if you don't have your scriptures handy, please grab them and read this along with me. If you will return, O Israel, says Yahweh, return to me. Put away your abominations out of my sight, then you will not be removed from this land. In other words, they will not be deported as Ephraim had been deported. And you shall swear, Yahweh lives in truth and justice and in righteousness, and the nations will bless themselves in him, and in him will they glory. So Jeremiah is promising that if the Jews will use Yahweh's name properly, if they will swear in it truthfully, upholding the judgments that were given to them in Exodus chapters 21 through 24. They will follow those judgments that establish liberty on the land, and they will uphold righteousness. Well, they will actually become a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And this is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise in Genesis 12:3 and Genesis 12:28-14, where God promises that in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So that was their first path. The very first path that Jeremiah sets before the Jews is to swear in Yahweh's name, to sanctify his name, to repent from idolatry, walk in the way of Yahweh, and you will become a blessing to all the nations of the earth. But he doesn't stop there, because there is a second path. There is a second option that Jeremiah sets before God's people. And this second path brings diaspora. It delivers them into the exact same state of affairs as Ephraim, where they are to live outside the protection of Yahweh's covenant. Jeremiah, again, made it his life's mission. Yahweh commissioned this for Jeremiah's life mission to bring back Judah into covenant with Yahweh. They had fallen into a system that used indulgences to excuse sin. I mean, this seems to be, how many times do religious organizations, religious institutions come up with systems of indulgence? And Jeremiah hits this one square on the head, because the people thought that Yahweh's law was nothing more than mere statute law that could be easily manipulated with the right words or the right loopholes. Now, in future episodes, I am going to be covering the ideas of statute law versus precept law, because this is something that we today really don't understand. Most of us I do approach the Torah as a Western ideology of statute law, where we have the wherefores, where ifs, and where one letter or one character can change the entire meaning of a paragraph. But that's not how Yahweh's law worked. Yahweh's law was founded upon precepts and principles that transcend simple wording. So a law could be expressed by multiple ways of saying it, but still retain the same exact concept and still be completely valid, because it's the idea of truth that, and it is the truth that underlines that precept. And again, we'll get into this later. But for now, we are focusing on the manipulation of the law that humanity has used for over 2,500 years. Because the Jews in Jerusalem had always looked for a get out of jail card, so they didn't have to obey the written law. During Jeremiah's days, the people did not have a heart for the precepts because they considered it nothing but rules and regulations. They never considered it to have policies for living a life that could establish peace and health, just not only for Israel's society, but it could spread to the entire world. They didn't embrace that concept because they reduced it to nothing but rules and regulations that were completely arbitrary, that were just some capricious law that God gave Israel to follow. And if you read the words of Jeremiah, read the words of Isaiah, they continually charge, and the words of Micah, they continually charge that this way of life was unfair and that they couldn't do it, rather than ever giving it a chance. Judah's attitude at this time sought to substitute just about anything for obedience to Yahweh. All they had to do was go to the temple and seek forgiveness through either sacrifice or prayer. In his indictment, Jeremiah, in chapters 7, verses 8 and 10, and turn there if you will, because we're going to jump into it right now, Jeremiah mentions 5 specific commandments that the people had breached. So turn with me to Jeremiah 7, and we are spending quite a bit of time in Jeremiah 7, and then we're going to jump to Jeremiah 12 and 16. So we're going to be, this whole class is in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 7 verses 8 and 10 states, "Behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. You steal, you murder, you commit adultery, and you swear falsely and burn incense to Baal." So here we have Israel trust in lying words that cannot profit. They break by stealing. Well, there's a commandment. Murder's another commandment. Adultery's another commandment. Swearing falsely in Yahweh's name, that's the third commandment. And idolatry by burning incense to Baal. So the Jews had completely rejected any knowledge of Yahweh. They were completely out of the way. They lost their understanding. They lost their way. And they walked after other gods whom you knew not. But yet these people, during this time, they would come and stand before Yahweh in his house, which is called by his name. And they would say, "We are delivered to do all these abominations." So they would say that, "Oh, we can continue to do this. We fulfilled the requirement of the law of either bringing a sacrifice or praying and asking for forgiveness. We fulfilled the requirement of the law, so we can just continue doing what we want to do." They never looked to the heart or the spirit. They never looked to what the intention of God's instructions were or the precepts, because they didn't have that heart and that spirit in them at this time. And human history continues to demonstrate our propensity to manipulate and cheat God. We ignore his instructions and we offer God what we want on our own terms to placate and offset our disregard for his law. This tradition continues today in both systems of Christianity and Judaism as alternate means of atonement, where we offend God. We break the law. We break what is specifically stated, but then we offer our man-made traditions. Oh, all you have to do is an act of kindness. Oh, all you have to do is repent and pray. And all of a sudden you're forgiven without any cleansing, no lasting healing code of what Leviticus says, that we have to remember the sins of our fathers. We have to acknowledge them and we have to confess them. Confess that our ancestors walked contrary to Yahweh. He walked contrary to us. And that begins this path of healing. We never do that in all of these alternate religious systems that always substitute something other than truth for the word of Yahweh. Now, Jeremiah warned this path would lead to the second option, being deported from the land and cast into foreign nations, as war and persecution would define both Judah's, the Jews in Jerusalem, as well as Ephraim's, which are today largely Christians. It would define their experience throughout the diaspora. Turn to Jeremiah. We're still in chapter 7. Jump down to verses 14 and 15. This is what Jeremiah prophesies. Therefore will I do this to my house, which is called by my name, wherein you trust, says Yahweh, the place where I gave you to your forefathers, and I will do unto it as I did to my house at Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my sight, as I have cast out all your brethren, even the whole seed of Ephraim. So here we find that God's judgment for the house of Ephraim and the house of Judah is completely the same. There's no double standards. There are no different judgments that are being used. And the relationship with Ephraim to Yahweh and the relationship with Judah to Yahweh is exactly the same. Yahweh is not biased, but rather he is not arbitrary, and he is just and fair in applying the breach for breaching the covenant, the consequences for breaching the covenant. And again, I want to stress that the relationship between these acts and the importance of fearing Yahweh and swearing in his names. Because Judah, especially as this history comes to an end, took oaths in Yahweh's name, but they did not uphold them. They worshiped false gods and violated their covenant with Yahweh through their actions. And this gave Yahweh a bad name. And despite opposition, Jeremiah continued to minister unto Judah. In Jeremiah 12, verses 16 and 17, he encouraged the Jews to learn the way of Yahweh's people. Notice this statement, Jeremiah stating, learn the way of Yahweh's people. It's eye-opening. It alleges that the Jews in Jeremiah's day had lost all wisdom, all understanding of walking in the way of Yahweh, of adhering to that written code of law. And they had made it, instead of a written law, which was very easy to follow, something that was a very nebulous concept. And instead, they departed and they walked in their own ways. Now, Jeremiah once again places this test before them. And he asks, would the Jews be willing to inherit the blessings of the law by swearing in Yahweh's name? And this is what Jeremiah states in 12 verses 16 and 17. And it shall come to pass, if you will diligently learn the ways of my people to swear by my name, as Yahweh lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then they shall be built in the midst of my people. But if they do not obey, I will utterly pluck them up and destroy that nation, says Yahweh. And again, that is Jeremiah 12, verses 16 and 17. This is a text that I'm sure many of us have a very hard time dealing with, because it's an admission that Judah had lost the way of Yahweh. They did not retain a knowledge and an accurate knowledge and understanding of Yahweh, but rather their theology tended towards Baalism. And this idea of learning the ways of Yahweh's people was not some nebulous concept. The way by which people walked in the way of Yahweh, the way by which they feared him, was swearing as Yahweh lives. At this point in Judah's history, she really did not care how her actions honored or dishonored Yahweh. She was hell-bent on walking in her own traditions. The people of Judah rejected Yahweh's written law. They had forgotten and abandoned it. And what was worse is that now they were swearing their oaths in the name of Baal. This was the hallmark of complete idolatry. And this idolatry was so complete that Yahweh's temple was now used for pagan rituals. Jump down to verse 30. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, says Yahweh. They have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to pollute it. Combining a place of Yahweh-centric worship with false gods completely profanes Yahweh's name. How was somebody going to distinguish between what was pure Yahwistic worship at the time versus what was Baal worship? How were they going to distinguish between the truths of Yahweh versus the pagan ideology? It completely denigrated something that was set apart. It polluted and it profaned the temple and it profaned Yahweh's name. They made Abraham's God common by worshiping him in accordance to pagan practices. But take note what Jeremiah is also showing us in these verses. Profaning Yahweh's name did not occur by speaking Yahweh's name. Let me reiterate that point. Yahweh was not profaned by speaking Yahweh's name, but rather it was the violating of obedience, the violation of the written law, the written covenant that profaned Yahweh's name. Because when a people are acknowledged to be the heir, Israel's heirs, any people, if any of us today, go out and we claim any allegiance to Yahweh's written word, and we we pledge any allegiance to the covenant, all of a sudden we become ambassadors. We represent Yahweh. Our actions, our words, and our deeds provide a witness for who our God is. And when we dishonor that through deception, when we dishonor that through oppression or some other malfeasance, that makes God's name, his reputation, it pollutes it and it makes it be profane at Mount Sinai. So you don't even have to use Yahweh's name, his literal name that he's bestowed to us. If you have any ties to a claim of Mount Sinai and you profane that reputation by your words, actions, and deeds, you're still profaning Yahweh's name. Just as Judah disregarded the written Torah continued, Yahweh implemented the curses stipulated for the breach of pact. In 598 BCE, Yahweh deported Judah's high-ranking officials and most of the royal house. The skilled craftsmen and the scribes were also deported to Babylon, along with Ezekiel, Daniel, King Jehoiakim, Esther's parents, and Mordecai. This left a small remnant on Judah's land for the final decade that they would exist as a kingdom. Would they hear Jeremiah's warnings? Would they obey and swear in Yahweh's name, or would they continue in their self-made traditions? Did they consider Jeremiah to speak Yahweh's words, or would their actions reveal that they still believed him to be a false prophet? After Nebuchadnezzar deported King Jeconiah and Zedekiah had secured his throne, Jeremiah knew that this was Judah's last opportunity, and he had to implement a divine intervention, a last-ditch effort to bring Judah back into covenant with Yahweh. If Jeremiah could not turn Zedekiah back to Yahweh, the nation would be forever lost, and the whole house of Israel would be given up to centuries of diaspora and persecution, just as Leviticus 26:33 stated that Yahweh would scatter them among the nations and draw the sword after them throughout diaspora, and the land would lie desolate. Because of this, Jeremiah implemented the final option, the final test. Would Judah finally be willing to swear in Yahweh's name? Or would she once again pollute it? At Mount Sinai, Yahweh promised freedom from oppression. In fact, deliverance from the house of bondage was a covenant of liberty. It promised that Israel, that her people would never again suffer under any oppressive system of government, because the stipulations in Yahweh's law established a righteous and balanced government that could not oppress the people. However, since the days of King Solomon, they began to once again embrace systems of government that led to oppression, just as 1 Samuel 8 had predicted. And in fact, this was the reason that Israel divided into nations and Ephraim departed from Judah, was because of oppression. Now, Judah's or Israel's very last release year occurred in 594 BCE. Their next release year, which would occur in 687, would deliver Israel, would not release them into salvation. It would release Israel into horrific oppression in Babylon and all the nations where Yahweh would scatter them. So 594 would be the last release year that Judah would have upon the land. And as the nations drew near, Jeremiah coaxed King Zedekiah to renew the Sinai covenant through an oath. You can find that in Jeremiah 34, verses 18, and again in verses 8 through 19. Go look at that on your own. Please put that in your notes and come back to it, because I want to focus on something very specific today. Jeremiah urged King Zedekiah and the elders in Jerusalem to learn the way of Yahweh's people by returning to Yahweh's written law. One of the law's provisions manumitted slaves every 7 years. You can find that in Deuteronomy 15, verse 12. And this account is again mentioned in Jeremiah 34, verses 13 and 14. As Judah's final release year approached, Zedekiah and the leading Jews in Jerusalem, the slaveholders, agreed to obey the law. They took an oath and they swore in Yahweh's name. And they basically said, as Yahweh lives, we will release all of our Hebrew slaves. We will let them go free, just as the law commanded. So this was killing two birds with one stone. They swore in Yahweh's name, they showed a fear of Yahweh, and they obeyed the law. And this law wasn't just some nebulous, manumission of slaves. It was actually a Sabbath. So by observing this, they're also showing a propensity to obey the Sabbath commandments regarding the release year. But it didn't take long, because they soon discovered that their depleted workforce impacted their profits. It made life difficult when you can't just go have your slaves pick your crops and increase production of your land-owning estates. And very soon they reneged on their covenant, and they went out and they recaptured the slaves that they had freed. They broke their word, and they made the covenant which they had swore in Yahweh's name into falsehood. And they profaned Yahweh's name by invoking, first by breaking the law in and of itself, but secondly by having taken an oath in Yahweh's name and then reneged on it. And this is Jeremiah's response to this sin. And we're going to be looking at Jeremiah 34, verses 13 and 16. So please turn with me there if you're not there already. This is Jeremiah's prophecy and his words, his admonition to the Jews who polluted Yahweh's name. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your forefathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, into which you have now turned and have done right in my sight. So in other words, what Jeremiah is stating is that in the past at Mount Sinai, Yahweh had made this covenant with them regarding the house of bondage. Israel had a tremendous lapse of apostasy where they had delivered themselves, sold themselves back into the house of bondage. But now they've done right, because now they're freeing themselves from this house of bondage by having done right in Yahweh's sight by letting their Hebrew slaves go free. Continuing in, this is what they did, in proclaiming liberty every man to his neighbor. And you have made a covenant before me in my house. So where did Zedekiah and the elders make this covenant with Yahweh? Well, they did it in the temple. They did it in my house, which is called by my name. But we're not finished, because now comes the admonition. But you have turned and polluted my name by causing every man his servant and every man his handmaid, whom you had set at liberty at their pleasure, to return, and brought them into subjection to be your servants and your handmaids. The Jews profaned Yahweh's name through disobedience and oppression. First, they had oppressed their fellow countrymen. Secondly, they falsely swore in Yahweh's name when agreeing to release their slaves, then went back on their word. This disobedience dishonored Yahweh. It gave Yahweh's name a really bad reputation. It violated the oath taken in their name, and their actions had to be held accountable. As Yahweh says in his covenant, he will not hold those guiltless who swear falsely in his name. And it was for this sin that Yahweh would destroy Judah's national independence and deport them into Babylon. Now, I want to take a little break here, because notice what Jeremiah does not state. Jeremiah does not state that the Jews profaned Yahweh's name by speaking Yahweh's name, but they profaned his name by their actions, which were oppressive. I mean, they were God's people. If you're God's people, you naturally bear God's reputation and his name, whether you use his name or not. Again, it's just a fact, because no other people, the Assyrians are not going to make any claims to Mount Sinai. The Egyptians are not going to make any claims to Mount Sinai. The Babylonians, the Indians, the Hindu, the Chinese, no other people on earth are going to make claims to Mount Sinai. But the moment you're going to claim that is a valid law, that it is a way of life, that you are walking in it, or that you're God's people, all of a sudden that becomes inseparable between you as God's people and that covenant and bearing Yahweh's name that he has revealed. So Judah did not sin by speaking the name, but by profaning the name through their actions, which violated the law. And each of us can profane Yahweh's name if we never even speak it, if our words and our actions violate Yahweh's law. And Judah polluted Yahweh's covenant, and they profaned Yahweh's name, and added to this sin was worshiping other gods. And this long track history of taking Yahweh's name in vain, or substituting his name for other gods, like, we're not going to use Yahweh's name, we're going to substitute it for another name, became a tradition that would repeat over and over and over again in Israel's history. And at no point in Jewish history do we have any record that there was a change of heart or a change of experience. And this led to Yahweh taking drastic measures. This led to Yahweh doing something that he had not done with Israel in all of her history before. It was divorcing himself from and his reputation from his people in order to insulate and protect his name and his reputation so it would not be profaned throughout the diaspora. Could you imagine what would happen if God's people, as they go through all the nations, they're exposed to Tammuz, and all of a sudden they start attributing Tammuz's doctrines to Yahweh's name. They go to Egypt and all of a sudden they start attributing Egyptian ideologies to Yahweh's name. That would make it so much harder for us today as we come out of the lies we've inherited from our forefathers to distinguish between right and wrong, to what is the word of Yahweh and what is not. Thankfully, Yahweh has sealed that testimony. He has concluded it so that we do have a frame of reference. We do have a point of comparison that we today can turn to, and that we can challenge today the iniquities we have inherited from our forefathers. A great way for us to reflect and to say, okay, was this a belief? Was this a path that benefited Israel? Is to look back and say, what action occurred afterwards? Was Judah delivered into blessing? Did they have peace? Did they have national stability? Or did Yahweh walk contrary to them? Did they have hardship, persecution, wars, famine, internal civil strife? Did they fight against each other? Did Ephraim fight against Judah and Judah against Ephraim, even though they were among other nations? These are questions that we have to pose as we awaken, as we turn back the tide. If we really want this movement to be something that goes beyond our generation, goes beyond you and me. I mean, we are beginning to age. We are beginning to, many of us, I can't tell you how many people in this back to Torah movement, the seeking out the paths of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So many of us have passed on. We've aged out and we're no longer there to encourage our fellow man to return. So, but those of us that are left, we still have an opportunity. We still have this last effort to seek Yahweh and to encourage others to this path. But there is something that I want to get into, but I don't feel like I have the time that I want to explore it today. In our discussion today, because it is a statement that has created the greatest division between the house of Judah and the house of Ephraim today. It is both a blessing and a curse that Jeremiah issues that totally altered history as we know it. And it is something I am going to say for next time. And I want to delve into this and really, really look at it and examine it, because it brings the heart, the importance of reversing our ancestors' sins through obedience, because it is only obedience that reverses that trajectory, that changes our future, as well as changes our past by what we do today. And it is that obedience of swearing in Yahweh's name, not falsely, but of following that written law. So join me next time as we delve into this issue and we keep exploring the final days of the choices that our ancestors made under Jeremiah and under his prophetic ministry, and how those choices have become a defining doctrine, a defining moment in the theologies and the systems under which we believe and we have inherited today. Thank you so much for the time you have spent with me. And I pray you will continue to investigate these ideas on your own. Don't take my word for it. Seek the text. Look at the text and see what the text says, because that is where our power lies. That is where our redemption lies. And that is how we can heal, and we can become not just 10, not 20 or 100 or 50 people. We can become thousands of people who take hold of the covenant to obey it today. From my home to yours, shalom.